Today I want to tell the story of an Oasis-related band about which very little is known. The band is called Tailgunner, not to be confused with the much newer British heavy metal band that came out in 2023. The original Tailgunner consisted of Noel Gallagher on drums, Mark Coyle, who was Oasis's live sound engineer, on guitar and vocals, and Paul Stacey, who played on and engineered various Oasis recordings in their second phase, on the bass. Mark Coyle and Noel Gallagher became mates long before the Oasis glory days, when they were both working for the Inspiral Carpets. The two of them became best mates and went on to work together throughout the 90s. By the end of the 90s, however, things were falling apart in the Oasis camp. On the 27th of March 1999, Oasis flew to France to start work on their fourth studio album. The album had been under construction throughout April, May and June, but clearly all was not well within the Oasis camp, because in July, news broke that guitarist and founding member Bonehead had left the band. And then, 2 weeks later, on the 25th of July, the news broke that another founding member, bass player Guigsy, had left as well. So, the band were falling apart, and that's not all. Brothers Liam and Noel, the frontman and the guitarist, were not getting on at all, even by their fairly low standards for getting on. Noel Gallagher had written the song Let's All Make Believe around this time, in which he seemed to basically admit that they weren't friends anymore, and it was really all just a facade. So, in early July, we got the announcement that Bonehead had left. In late July, we got the announcement that Guigsy had left. But, right smack bang in the middle of those two announcements, when all the chaos was happening, there was another announcement that often gets overlooked in Oasis history. Right in the eye of the storm, on the 17th of July, it came out that Noel Gallagher was forming a new pub rock trio. And the very next day, on the 18th of July, a follow-up article gave a few more details, saying, Noel Gallagher has formed a new band called Tailgunner. Insiders say Tailgunner, named after a specialist US porn magazine, are looking to make their live debut at a pub gig sometime next month. But it's not likely Noel's new project will overshadow his work with Oasis. And then, from that point onwards, there was about 6 months of silence about Tailgunner. The first single from Oasis's new album, Go Let It Out, came out on the 7th of February 2000. And then, the very next day, there was also an announcement that in the past 6 months, Tailgunner had also recorded their first album. It had been completed and was ready for release round about December 1999 or January 2000. Which means work had started on the album very shortly after Standing on the Shoulder of Giants had been finished, but at different studios, Wheeler End and the Old Homestead. Truth be told, the schedule looks so tight that it looks entirely possible that Noel Gallagher finished work on Standing on the Shoulder of Giants and then immediately left the Oasis camp with the Tailgunner boys and went straight into the studio with them, almost as if it was a kind of respite or escape from everything that was going on with Oasis. In fact, it turned out Noel was so into the project that he actually wanted to release the album before the new Oasis album was released. But it was round about this time that Alan McGee decided to shut down Creation Records, to whom Oasis was signed. And of course, this meant mountains of paperwork and delays. Noel said, "We're trying to get the album back off Sony, because everything went into Sony when Creation folded." The Tailgunner album was supposed to be out a month or 6 weeks before ours, but then it all went to shit with Creation. And so, Oasis's Standing on the Shoulder of Giants came out first. It was released at the end of February, but 2 weeks after its release, another article appeared which showed just how unhappy and discontent Noel Gallagher was in Oasis, and also referenced Tailgunner. Noel Gallagher has written 3 songs for his solo album, and has revealed he wants to do a lot less in Oasis. The spokesman couldn't say when or if the album recorded by Noel's side project band Tailgunner will be released. In a little over 2 months, however, all the legal wrangling was apparently sorted, and Tailgunner was signed not to Big Brother, but to No Label Records. And the release date was announced, as well as one of the most obscure Oasis-related rarities I've ever heard of. What I think might be the last ever Creation-branded record that Noel Gallagher played on. Copies of the band's album were pressed and originally set for release on Creation Records. If that's true, those Creation-branded Tailgunner CDs will be very collectible, if they really are out there. The article continued along the now familiar theme of just how unhappy Noel Gallagher was in Oasis. Noel Gallagher, who is reported to have quit Oasis in today's Daily Mirror newspaper, plays drums on 6 tracks on the album. Gallagher offered to drum after the longtime pals met up again, while Noel was demoing material for what became Standing on the Shoulder of Giants. And here's what that Mirror article was referring to. Oasis guitarist Noel Gallagher has walked out of the group's world tour amid reports of a row with his brother Liam. The group have cancelled a concert planned for Tuesday night in Paris, but are planning to continue the tour from next week with a replacement guitarist, Matt Dayton. At this time, the band were in turmoil. Noel Gallagher's marriage was falling apart and he seemed pretty unhappy. The inevitable massive blow-up between him and Liam had happened backstage at a gig in Barcelona, which they'd had to cancel because drummer Alan White had tendinitis. The band went to the venue, drank their way through the rider, and then a fight occurred between Liam and his brother Noel, during which Liam insulted Noel's daughter, saying things that, according to Noel, could never be forgiven. And I don't know, but it just seemed to me as I researched this that Tailgunner for Noel Gallagher was kind of a bit of a distraction. It was a bit of an escape. I think it was a bit of fun with Mark Coyle, his best mate, primarily just to take his mind off all the chaos that seemed to be happening everywhere else in his life. So, following the blow-up with Liam, Noel left the band, and they continued the tour with replacement guitarist Matt Dayton. Dayton filled in for the band's European dates, with Noel returning to the band when they played Dublin on July the 8th. And again, it's just speculation, but I think in that time, he kind of mentally made his peace with coming back to the band and finding a way forward. I think, on some level, when he returned to the band, the sabbatical was over. Of course, what actually followed next was the infamous Wembley gig, which is considered by many to be their most disastrous gig ever. So the issues in Oasis were not sorted, but for better or for worse, Noel was now, basically, back. And lining up with this, after his live return with Oasis, Noel told the press, incorrectly, that he had been fired from Tailgunner. Perhaps this was all planned with the intent of drumming up media interest for Tailgunner's upcoming tour, or perhaps this was his way of breaking it gently to Mark Coyle, that, now that Oasis were limping onwards once again, this was probably it for him in Tailgunner. 4 days later, Tailgunner's first tour dates were announced, along with their first single, Coming Back Home, which was due for release on August the 28th, with Noel on drums. A follow-up single was also slated for October the 9th. In that same article, the Tailgunner website was also announced, along with the statement that the site was under construction, but should be up and running in the next few days. However, a brief flick through snapshots saved on the Wayback Internet Archive machine shows that the website was never finished, and remained under construction for several years before just closing down completely, and seemingly at some point in recent years turning back into a porn site. And 5 days after these singles and the tour were announced, Mark Coyle responded to the suggestion that he had fired Noel. Noel Gallagher was not sacked from the band, as he recently claimed. Coyle said that although Gallagher was no longer with Tailgunner, he remained the best fucking mate I've ever had, adding that he wouldn't dream of kicking the troubled guitarist out of his band. But at this point, Noel Gallagher's involvement with Tailgunner as a member of the band really was basically over, and it lines up very closely with the most tumultuous and difficult time, pretty much, in Oasis history. On the 4th of August, the band played a sold-out debut gig in Glasgow, but many of the crowd were disappointed to not see Noel Gallagher behind the kit. The replacement drummer, however, Jack Mitchell, would go on to be the drummer in Johnny Marr's band. Then, the release date of the long-awaited Tailgunner album was given as September the 18th. And we learned that the cover art to the album was designed by both Mark Coyle and Noel Gallagher. The tour got underway, and on the 22nd of September, The Guardian reviewed one of the gigs, saying, "Looking like a bunch of unreconstituted football hooligans, Tailgunner are unfeasibly loud. After mixing Oasis, Coyle's hearing may well require medical attention, but there's something refreshing about his 4 pieces unapologetic row. It's a bizarre irony that nowadays successful people are allowed the luxury of producing music this raw." And then on the 31st of October, although Noel Gallagher didn't get behind the kit, Noel, Gem and Andy from Oasis Mark II showed up to a gig. But at that gig, the crowd made it plain just why Tailgunner had been getting so much interest from the NME. And as I'm sure you're aware, it wasn't really because of the band, it wasn't really because of the music, it was just because of Noel. Noel Gallagher, Andy Bell and Gem Archer caused chaos at the Tailgunner show in Oxford last night by arriving at the venue unannounced and prompting rumours of an impromptu Oasis show. Noel sat in the pub for 2 hours before the gig, near the window, and within half an hour the gig had sold out. Word got around Oxford that he was going to be at the show pretty quickly, and before long they were all under siege with fans looking for autographs. Others thought that Oasis were the support band. Gallagher spent the entire evening fending off autograph hunters watching the show, which culminated with Coyle demolishing his equipment by setting fire to his guitar. The first Tailgunner single came out, but it didn't really make an impact. The album came out, and again, unfortunately, didn't really make waves. As far as I've been able to establish, the promised second single never did actually materialise, and the band seemingly had no record label shortly after. In some form, however, Tailgunner carried on, because in 2006, they supported Noel when he played a solo gig. And then, in February 2014, it became apparent that the band was still going after 15 years, in some capacity, with Mark Coyle finally giving the obvious reason Noel had had to leave the band. He was just too busy. The Tailgunner story was covered almost exclusively by the NME, who wrote favourably about the band until it became completely clear that they were not going to be big. At which point the magazine became a little more negative. A retrospective review came out in September 2005, which said, "Their debut LP is long, slow and deadly. If you hear a more dreary apology for a rock and roll record this year, you can consider yourself desperately unlucky. Coyle's voice makes Ian Brody's sound charismatic. Gallagher makes Oasis drummer Tony McCarroll sound like Buddy Rich. And rather than being a zonked out rock record, Tailgunner sounds like a bunch of D-grade stoners living out their Neil Young fantasies in some airless Moss Side shooting range. Coyle's unique tragedy is that, thanks to his drummer's day job, a record that should have been quietly left to die in the bargain bins is now going to be pored over and ridiculed by a large number of people. As Coyle will be learning to his cost, the danger of standing on the shoulder of giants is that you have a long way further to fall." But I have to say, I completely disagree. I've listened through the whole album, I've got it on CD, and I think it's really cool. It's weird, it's swampy, it's a bit psychedelic in places, definitely, but I kind of like records like that. I don't want cookie cutter stuff. I like stuff that's a little bit unexpected. Though in many ways the whole Tailgunner project had a real sloppy, apathetic disorganisation about it, the website that said it was under construction forever being a good example. The music was nonetheless well worth a listen, even if it is just a rare and obscure Oasis-related curio these days. There was actually a second album also recorded in 2001, but it was never released through a label. But as of quite recently, both Tailgunner albums are now available on Spotify, so I'd love to know what you guys think. I will just make 2 quick disclaimers, however. This is not Oasis. Don't go in there expecting to hear She's Electric and Wonderwall. And secondly, this isn't an album made for the zero attention span generation. You can't really appreciate it, in my opinion, without listening it through at least once from start to finish. So, next time you've got a 45-minute drive, flip it on, have a listen, and enjoy. Let me know your thoughts and memories of Tailgunner down in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, I'll see you next time. And a massive thank you to all my kind supporters on Patreon. If you would be interested in supporting this channel, getting access to exclusive content and ad-free videos, please check out the link in the description, and hopefully I'll see you inside.